Hello guys and welcome to my new video. So today we're going to be continuing the series and looking at the best ranged DPS for Antorus. We'll be looking at the raid scenarios, we'll be looking at DPS for mythic, heroic Antorus raid, we'll be looking at different specs, different classes. We'll be comparing tier 21. Now this video is going to be looking at the numbers, it's going to be looking at the numbers for heroic, for mythic, it's going to be looking at the deep ranged DPS composition by the top end guilds in the mythic world first, boss kills and things like that. So I'm going to be using multiple parameters to determine what spec is doing better, what class is doing a little bit better and things like that. Keep in mind that if you're not doing top end progression, I'd say this at all of my videos, all of these type videos, it's not going to affect you. Play the class that you enjoy the most. This video is purely to show you for the people who are trying to min-max. Maybe they have the option of switching different specs. So maybe this video will help you out to look at what specs are doing really well. But like I mentioned, if you're not doing high-end progression, stick to the class, stick to the spec that you enjoy the most, and progress on towards at your own pace. But now, let's look at the best range DPS class, or one of the strongest range DPS classes right now. So it's no surprise that it's going to be a Warlock. First of all of the three Warlock specs are doing really quite well. All of them are passing quite well for single target, for AoE, for multi-cleave, for 2-target, 4-target and things like that. But the point is that one of the specs is just doing insanely strong on all the aspects, on single target, on AoE, multi-cleave, so it kind of brings down the other specs a little lower. So Affliction Warlocks have been probably one of the strongest range classes, maybe even specs in the game for Antorus and even Mythic Plus. Affliction is just doing insanely strong. For really top end Mythic guilds, Affliction was used quite a lot. First of all, Antorus is a multi-daughter heaven. There's a lot of fights. It's about 50% of Antorus fights, but there's going to be ads showing up during the fight, or there's going to be like 2-target ads or 3-target or 4-target ads throughout the whole fight. So dot classes were really strong for this expansion. A good example of this is Coven of Shivara, where ranged daughters were basically the only classes that were invited for the mythic progression. Melee wasn't even showing up there because daughters were so strong, and that fight is basically an example of what Antorus has turned out to be. So much dotting potential, and Affliction Warlocks are one of the best dot classes in the game. They have good AoE, good multi-dotting potential. Their tier 21 is strong. All of the Warlock tier 21 is actually really strong. Now, when I talk about tier 21, at this point in the expansion, you most likely will be weighing tier 21 4 set or whatever, no matter what, because the item level is going to be so big while compared to your tier 20. Like Affliction Warlock tier 24 set is quite strong when at the same item, when you compare to the same item level to tier 21. But you most likely will be using tier 21 if it's like 15 to 20 item levels higher than your tier 20. So you can assume you'll have your tier 21, which is quite strong for AoE as well. Tier 21 2 set is actually very strong by itself. And Affliction has been doing really strong. Not only the DPS, but also things like utility, things like Warlock portals or gateways, which are kind of mandatory for a lot of the fights. So Warlocks have been really strong. You have Demonology. Demonology in Tomb of Sargeras was considered as the best single target spec for Warlocks. The Demonology Warlocks were simming or parsing really high for single target. It kind of didn't turn out like this for Antorus. I mean, Demonology does parse better on certain single target fights, like on Heroic Varimatras. Demonology parses a little higher than the other Warlock specs, but overall there's not a huge single target difference. Similar to Destruction. Destruction has a very good potential for multi-target or 2-target fights. Like you can see this in Fellhounds. Destruction is actually simming or parsing really high for Fellhounds, really high for Coven, and they're really good for those kind of fights. But like I mentioned, Warlock's in a good position, but Affliction is just another level. It's another level that is just like, it makes me want to try and level an Affliction Warlock, but I know when I do that, they're going to nerf them. So I'm not sure what's going to happen in the future, but Affliction is insanely strong right now. Like I said, really good single target, pretty good single target. Absolutely broken AoE, absolutely broken multi-dotting potential, Seed Corruption and things like that, just working really well. So Affliction is really strong. So now let's look at balanced druids. So balanced druids, like I mentioned, dot classes are really strong, and balanced druid dot potential has been increased with their tier 21 4-set. Tier 21 4-set increases their dots, and a lot of dot potential on Antorus meant balanced druids were doing really well. They were brought in by multiple guilds. There was like multiple top end guilds brought like 2 balanced druids for a lot of the AoE fights. Unfortunately, if you do play a balanced druid, you know that you know how painful it is to itemize for single target for AoE. Because for single target, you probably will want to use tier 20 4-set, because tier 20 is considerably better for single target than tier 21. We're talking about pure single target fights. And then on AoE fights, there are multiple legendary combinations that you can use for balanced druid depending on the situation. So you do have to have a good amount of legendaries available to you if you want to min-max the AoE fight. But like I said, balanced druids are extremely strong for AoE fights. Things like Antorus High Command, things like Anar, things like Portal Keeper Hazabel, where you have to kill the fire imps that spawn, and those imps need to be interrupted. Solar Beam can mass interrupt them. Then you can burst them if you pool your resources before the imps arrive. So you're really strong for AoE fights. You're really strong for AoE fights. And things like Coven, where balanced druids are doing parsing extremely well. But on a single target, it's a lot different. First of all, like I mentioned, tier 24 set was considerably higher for single target than tier 21. That basically means the more gear that everyone gets, balanced druid will slowly swap over to tier 21 4-set for single target, because it's going to outlevel tier 20. But the point is, the tier is not single target. It's not really great for single target. It's more for AoE, and balanced druids have fallen down quite a lot on single target. They're parsing like one of the lowest single target DPS in the game right now on fights like Gorothi, Imanar, Kingarat, Varimatras. Balanced druids are at the bottom, and that's purely to do with how the tier 21 turned out. And just because of that, it's almost worth considering if you're a balanced druid, if you have the option to maybe swap over to like Feral on single target fights. Feral is simming really well on single target and AoE. But you can swap out the Feral on single target, and when it comes down to AoE, you can kind of do a balanced druid if you really want to min-max the DPS. But like I mentioned, balanced druids, amazing dot potential, pretty poor on single target right now, if we're looking at the heroic, mythic logs and things like that. Now let's look at a class that's kind of hard to determine which is the best spec, mages. So if we look at the top end guild, group composition, range group composition, Frost mages were probably the kings. Like Exorsus even brought in 3 Frost mages for a lot of the single target fights. Frost is considered the single target spec. Fire is pretty decent at single target, pretty good at much better on AoE. Arcane is actually coming up as well. So in really high end mythic progression, Frost was the king. There was a lot of Frost mages brought in for single target fights. There were a few Fire mages brought in for AoE, but it was more of a deal like, why would we bring a Fire mage when we can bring a balanced druid, Shadow Priest, or Affliction Warlock? It was that kind of deal. So there were not that many Fire mages in really high-end mythic Antorus progression. Now, based on the parses for heroic and mythic, it's a different deal. It's a very different deal on which spec is doing really well. You can see that Frost is doing a bit better on single target fights like Varimatras, Kingarat than Arcane or Fire. But the numbers are not that big. There's not a huge difference between the single target between Fire and Arcane when compared to Frost. If you want to min-max, yeah, Frost is most likely going to be your better single target spec. But if you look at AoE fights, on AoE and multi-target fights like Antorus High Command and Anar, Arcane and Fire are doing much better. It's also worth noting that there are not a lot of parses. There are not a lot of parses for Arcane. Similar to it's similar to Warlocks, where there weren't that many passes for Destruction and Demonology when compared to Affliction, because Affliction was doing so well. For Mages, it's kind of similar. Arcane is actually pushing really good numbers for AoE and decent numbers for single target, but there's not that many Arcane Mages when compared to something like Fire. So when you're looking at Mages, first of all, Mage tier 21 is pretty decent. It's nothing like crazy amazing. It's very decent from actually all of the specs. It's a decent spec. Based on item level, you most likely will be using tier 21 Foresight anyways. But you have to consider here, Frost is probably the best spec for single target, but at the same time the difference between the single target between Fire and Arcane is not that big, and the difference between the AoE between Frost and Fire and Arcane is actually quite substantial. So you have to consider what you want to do. Do you want to min-max single target, or do you want to play a spec that's pretty decent at all of the situations in Antorus? This is the class that I had the hardest time to determine, which is the best spec for all of the Antorus. Like, I mean, it's really hard to determine it. Play the class or the spec that you feel you're most comfortable with or you enjoy. There really isn't a clear winner for Mages, and especially considering that Arcane is kind of making a comeback, even though there's not that many Arcane Mages parsing in the game right now. So let's look at Shadow Priest. So Shadow Priest tier 21 is basically purely a single target set. It used to be an AoE set like a long time ago, a couple of months ago. Their tier 21 was changed so many times that it just became a pure single target set. But again, Shadow Priests are dot classes, and dot classes are doing extremely well in Antorus. And you can see that on fights like Fellhounds and Coven of Shivara, where Shadow Priests are like top 2, top 3 specs in the game for those fights. But you also have to consider that because with the item level right now in the expansion with Antorus, a lot of people have high item levels and things like that. For fights where the adds can die quite quickly, like Antorus High Command, NR, the adds can be kind of sniped. Portal Keeper has a belt, the Fire Imps can be actually sniped by DPS that can, like, you know, do really quick burst instant DPS. Like Shadow Priest DPS will suffer because Shadow Priests require the adds to live for substantially long, and you can see this because Shadow Priests are passing really well for Fellhounds, really well for Coven of Shivara, with the adds will stay up for majority of the fight. And you can see the Shadow Priests are kind of dipping on other AoE fights like Antorus High Command or NR, where the adds can be sniped. So this is the progression of item level that has brought down Shadow Priest AoE a little bit down, just because of how fast the adds are being killed or destroyed. You have to keep that in mind. But Shadow Priests overall are ranking pretty well purely because of how strong their dotting potential is. So you have to consider that. So let's look at Elemental Shamans. Elemental Shamans in really high-end mythic progression, they weren't used. There weren't that many elemental. I don't think there were at all any Elemental Shamans really high-end progression. Purely because like Enhancement Shaman single target was probably one of the best single targets in the game. So there weren't that many Elemental Shamans in really high-end rating. But Elemental Shamans, very similar to what Shadow Priest, to what Balanced Druids are going through right now. They're pretty good at AoE fight. They're very good at AoE fights, but they're pretty low on single target. I forgot to mention that Shadow Priest single target is similar to what Balanced Druids are going through right now. At the bottom, fighting at the bottom. But they're great at AoE. Similar to what Elemental Shamans, like I said, are going through. But it's different for Elemental Shamans because their AoE is more to do with cleave AoE. The adds have to be grouped together. And they're great at sniping adds. You look at Antorus High Command, you look at NR, you look at Portal Keeper Hazabel when the imps arrive. They can use their artifact ability and just kill the adds in instant. They can kill the adds in instant because they're all grouped up and they're all pretty close together. And their Elemental Shamans are passing really high on those fights. Antorus High Command, NR, Portal Keeper, they're doing really well. But on spread AoE fights, things like Coven, Elemental Shamans are pretty down. Their AoE just does not fit that kind of a mechanic. Their single target is pretty down at the bottom. It's very similar to what balanced druids are going through, is what's similar to what shadow priests are going through. So it's quite similar when you compare these strong AoE classes, that their single target is not that strong. You kind of get best of one world, but you're not great in another part. That's the general consensus of a lot of these classes. So, except for Affliction Warlocks. But let's look at hunters. So first of all, Marksmanship and Beastmastery. Marksmanship was probably the only spec that was used in really high-end mythic progression. Marksmanship was actually stacked. A lot of guilds, top-end world first guilds, stacked like 2 or 3 Marksmanship Hunters for a lot of the fights. Marksmanship Hunter tier 21 is a lot to do with AoE. It has been buffed, so a lot of the Marksmanship Hunters will be using tier 21 forset for single target just because of the item level. Similar to Beastmastery. Beastmastery tier 21 has been buffed as well. You have to consider the Hunter tier 21 was probably one of the from all of the classes, survival as well. Tier 21 was actually probably one of the weakest tier 21s for a specific class, which was quite sad to see. But it has been buffed. Marksmanship is considered the raiding spec when you compare it to Beastmastery, because Beastmastery, and you can see it on the numbers as well, for heroic and mythic logs, Marksmanship is just parsing higher than Beastmastery on single target, on AoE, on majority of the fights. Marksmanship actually is simming quite well for a lot of the AoE fights, things like Antorus High Command, NR, Coven. Marksmanship would probably be mid to top specs in the game right now for AoE fights like Antorus High Command, NR, Coven. For single target, there will be somewhere around the mid. You can see it on things like Barry Matches and different pure single target fights. But when you compare it to Beastmastery, Beastmastery is just below Marksmanship. So that's why I say that Marksmanship would be considered the raid spec for hunters. But if you enjoy the mobility of Beastmastery, because Beastmastery is probably one of the most mobile DPS specs in the game, ranged DPS specs in the game, and if you enjoy the playstyle, just go with it. Beastmastery is not doing that bad. So this has been an overview of the ranged DPS classes for Antorus. General consensus is that a class that's great at AoE won't be that great at single target, or a class that's great at single target won't be that amazing at AoE. That's the general consensus of a lot of these classes. You most likely will be using tier 21 forset because of the item levels. And like I have to mention this again, this is showcasing the potential of classes based on numbers. These are not my personal opinions. These are numbers, these are like thousands and thousands of parses, thousands and thousands of logs that I've looked through, that I've checked out, that there's statistics that are available for it, the composition of the top end guilds, the classes they used. So it's not just my personal opinion. And you also have to consider that if you don't want to min-max, if you don't want to go for the hard, you don't want to pick a class that's like, you need these classes for this fight. If you're not in that type of a guild, you don't need to play these classes. Just play the class that you enjoy the most and have fun with it. But thank you for watching this guide. Let me know how you feel about these specs. Let me know how you feel about these classes. Which class you do enjoy playing the most? Which class do you think should be nerfed or should be balanced? I can't wait for your opinions. And I thank you for watching this guide, and I'll see you next time.